We are in the 7th of a 9-week series on the apocalypse. We've almost made it there. People usually think of an apocalypse as being about the end of the world, but as we've already talked about, that word itself, apocalypse, actually means an unveiling, a revelation. And apocalyptic writing is most often used, and by the way, this type of writing was prominent in the 200 years before and after Jesus. So just around that 400-year time period, revolving around the time of Jesus, this was a common way for people to write about times of trouble and what was really going on in the world, to reveal what was really happening in these times of suffering, especially suffering for the faithful. It was a means of trying to address questions people of faith had about how a good and loving God, who was powerful, could allow such suffering to take place, why it seemed as though evil had the upper hand. In Revelation in particular, the author, John, is acknowledging that evil is very much at work in the world. It is a reality that people are having to face, and that evil will eventually pay the price of judgment. But rather than being about God destroying the earth in some future time, John's revelation is really about the destructive power of the empire in the present and God's hope of saving the world from that destination. The last couple of weeks in our series, if you've been with us, the last few chapters of Revelation that we've covered have been pretty action-packed. We've talked about the 7 seals and the blowing of the 7 trumpets, all of which revealed all sorts of destruction and violence. But rather than visions of violence that God will send to earth as punishment, in the way that we've been reading it, or at least the way I've been reading it, these are the unveilings of the destructive nature of the powers at work in the world already in John's day in that first century. These aren't thunderbolts that God is sending down on an unrepentant humanity. Instead, this is God's perspective of what's already happening, the violence that's being wreaked upon humanity because of the way power is being exercised. And God is unveiling all of this through John's vision in order to offer an opportunity to repent, to turn around, to find a different way, to offer a more Jesus-y path forward. Revelation is John's vision of our opportunity at liberation and deliverance from the destructive ways of the world. Today we turn to chapter 12, and we'll spend a lot of our time in chapter 12 and 13 this morning, where we find some of the most common images from the book of Revelation, things that you've known of in Revelation, even if you haven't read Revelation. And I know some of you still haven't read Revelation, but as we move through into chapter 12, we get some common references. First, we're introduced to a new image to us. We meet a cosmic woman who we're told is clothed with the sun and the moon and stars, and told that she is about to give birth. And we're introduced to one of those images that most of us know, her adversary, a 7-headed, 10-horned red dragon. We're told that the child that this woman is about to bear is going to be the ruler of all nations, which is a clear allusion to the promise of the coming Messiah. And so we immediately draw an inference that this is some depiction of Mary. In some ways, she's also a depiction of Israel, all those who are faithful, all those who bear the Messiah and the way of the Messiah to the world. And John is very clear about who the dragon is. In fact, a few verses later, he says it outright, that the dragon is the devil and Satan the deceiver of the whole world. In his vision, John writes that just as this dragon is preparing to devour the child as this woman is bringing it forth into the world, the child is snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. This seems to be an allusion to the crucifixion of Jesus, the Messiah, and the resurrection of Jesus, the ascension of Jesus to God in heaven and to his throne. And it alludes to the fact that many people thought that it was the devil, Satan, behind that crucifixion, that just when it seems as though evil has gotten its way and Jesus is dead and gone, there's victory where we expected none. Jesus conquers death and ascends into heaven. And recalling who actually killed Jesus, the authorities and powers of Rome, helps us to understand who this dragon devil is in John's story. After this woman's son ascends to God, she flees to a place of God's protection. John calls it a place of God's nourishment for 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years. And if you were with us last Sunday, we talked about this number then as well. This appears several times in the book of Revelation, sometimes as 1,260 days, sometimes as 3.5 years, sometimes as 42 months. All of those are symbolic time periods. If you remember that number 7 in Hebrew numerology, it means fullness or wholeness or perfection. And so rather than being the fullness of time, which would be 7 years, what 7 years might symbolize, this is kind of half of that. So John is saying in essence that this woman is going to be pursued by the dragon, under threat of the dragon, for a lengthy period of time, but not forever. So it is a lengthy but limited period of tribulation for her. So John is saying essentially that the faithful, the church, those who carry this message of the Messiah, will be threatened by the dragon for a while, but not forever. John is essentially depicting here a world in a struggle between the powers of good and evil, and says that during this struggle, there will be this wilderness period. By the way, just as an aside, wilderness in Scripture doesn't always mean just a bad place. It means a place of struggle, but struggle isn't always entirely bad. Like when Jesus was preparing for ministry, the first thing he does is enter the wilderness for 40 days of temptation. He had to go through that period of wilderness in order to be prepared for who he was becoming. Wilderness most often is meant as a time of preparation. The Israelites, before they enter into the promised land, remember, after they're freed from Egypt, they go through 40 years in the wilderness. And we sometimes think of that as just a time of punishment, but it's not just punishment, it's a time of preparation. They have to prepare to be the people that God is calling them to be. God had taken them out of Egypt, but the wilderness is what got Egypt out of them. Well, the wilderness is what got that mindset of their imprisonment out of them. The wilderness is this time of preparation. And John is saying that's where the church is. That's where the faithful are in this battle between good and evil. In his vision, that battle's already been waged and won in the heavenly realm. Good has triumphed, but the powers of evil are left to operate on earth for this lengthy but limited period of time. So in verse 10, he hears this voice in heaven declaring, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and Messiah." So understand, he's saying the kingdom is already here. He's already actually talked about that. We talked about that last week and the week before. The kingdom is here. It's present already. For the accuser, the devil, the accuser of our comrades has been thrown down. They have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. John is saying there that those who have stood faithful, who have stood by the truth of who Jesus is, not given in to the ways of empire, not idolized the emperor or the empire, even though they paid with their lives, they were the ones that conquered evil. They're the conquerors, though the world would see it differently. Rejoice, you heavens, and those who dwell in them, but woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. Again, John knows and is recognizing that the present is fraught with difficulty for those who seek to be faithful, but he's trying to give this word of encouragement to them, that difficulty will not last. It's really important here to note, too, how John paints the role of the devil in his story. The role of Satan for John is as the deceiver. That's crucial because those who follow the dragon in John's story don't always recognize that they are following a path of evil. They're just doing what's a natural part of being in Rome. They're following into the ways of Rome. They're not seeking to do evil, they're just being Roman citizens. But John keeps warning them, warning the Christians among them, not to give in, not to be fooled into thinking that there's nothing harmful about the ways of empire in which they're participating. Chapter 13 then goes on to reveal that this deceiver dragon operates in the world by virtue of a couple of other characters that you probably find familiar, two beasts, to which the dragon is given its authority. This is another callback, by the way, to the book of Daniel. So the book of Daniel has those apocalyptic visions in the Old Testament, and Daniel chapter 7, the prophet sees 4 great beasts emerge from the sea, much like the beast in Revelation. They've got 10 horns, just like the beast in Revelation. They represent the kings of the earth, just like the beast in Revelation. In this beast, John is talking about the empire. So in that first century setting, especially the faithful Jews among his audience, which would have been a vast number of them, they would have readily recognized that the beasts are the empire and its leaders. This beast arises out of the sea, representing Rome, which was this great maritime power. And more notably in John's vision, the people worship the beast. Remember, this has been a constant thing in Revelation. John's been warning them not to worship the emperor and the empire, because that was a common part of everyday life, not to fall in, to give in to that way of empire, because here he says worship of the beast, of the empire, is in fact worship of the way of the dragon, the Satan. Here he's making this direct link between the two. Worship of the empire is worship of the stark opposite way to the way of God. And John uses the beast as a means of talking about how monstrous this empire has become. Chapter 13 is also where we find one of perhaps the most familiar thing in Revelation for many people, the mark of the beast, that dreaded number 666. You know the number, right? Like when they pull it up at the grocery store and you're checking out, you're like, well, maybe I'll get some gum too. Some people have a literal fear of the number 666. There's actually a term for the fear of the number 666. Check this one out. Let's try that. Hexacosioi hexacontahexaphobia. How's that? I think that's actually worth 666 points in Scrabble. But what is the deal with this number, 666? Well, again, remember what the symbolism of the number 7 means. 7 is symbolic of wholeness, perfection, fullness. And 6 is just the opposite. 6 is falling short of that. 6 is pretending to be perfect, whole. So one that's marked with 666 is one who pretends to be divine, like the emperor. One who feigns perfection, but who is actually anything but. It is like imperfection to the nth degree. So while the person who bears this number might pretend to be perfect and divine, he is anything but. And John is clear that about this number, it refers to someone's name. So in the Hebrew numerology, in the Hebrew alphabet, every Hebrew letter had a number associated with it. So you could take your name in Hebrew and add up the numbers of each of the letters of your name and total whatever your name comes to. So all sorts of names can add up to this total, 666. And throughout history, there have been a number of conjectures of who this is, who this number refers to. You might not be surprised that 60, 70 years ago, all sorts of people found ways that Adolf Hitler's name added up to 666 because it seemed fitting. And there are ways to do that, where in Hebrew, Adolf Hitler makes 666. Others suggested in later years that Ronald Wilson Reagan was 666 because there's 6 letters in each of his names, and eventually he moved into a house with the address 666. And in more recent years, Barack Obama was one of the names that people found ways to add up to 666. There were also those who took it as a sign of the Antichrist when John F. Kennedy received 666 votes in the Democratic National Convention. But as interesting as all of those modern ideas might be, most serious scholars agree that the most likely candidate for 666 in John's writing is Emperor Nero. Caesar Nero in Hebrew adds up to 666. And Emperor Nero, Caesar Nero, ruled probably at the beginning of John's life. He was no longer emperor by the time John was writing this, but Nero was renowned for being evil by all sorts of folks, not just Christians and Jews. But Nero had persecuted Christians during his reign. He had ordered and initiated the war against the Jews in Jerusalem, which eventually led to the destruction of the temple. He had murdered members of his own royal family who he felt threatened by. He had overseen the empire's exploitative and repressive ways. In many respects, Nero was like the epitome of evil. John, in all likelihood, is talking about Nero, but he's not just talking about Nero. He's talking about Nero as an example of the empire gone awry. He's talking about imperial power in all its forms. That's why the beast has 7 heads. The empire had 7 emperors by that time. This beast is the beast of the empire. The first emperor was Julius Caesar, then there was Augustus, then Tiberius, then Caligula, then Claudius. Nero was the 6th. And by the way, in the story, the 6th head of the beast had suffered a mortal wound to its head. Nero died through suicide by putting a dagger through his neck. Suffered this mortal wound to his head, which, by the way, lent credence to some of the whole John F. Kennedy thing, the wound to his head. But there was also rumors among the empire that Nero wasn't really dead. He was like Elvis. And so there was this idea that he was coming back, and so John has this almost playful way of talking about, seemed to be a mortal wound but had recovered. In some ways like a parody of Jesus. There was also the fact that Nero was the last of the initial royal family of the Roman Empire. After that, that family vanished from the scene, and it really sent Rome into a time of turmoil and civil war for a while. Many thought it was the death throes of the empire, but after a time, the empire recovered. And so too does this beast. Chapter 13 closes with a direct appeal by John to his readers, to those who are hearing this word, in order that they understand what he is demanding of them. He says in verse 10, "If you are to be taken captive, into captivity you go. If you kill with the sword you must be killed." Saying, don't fight back. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. So again, this is a part of John's message that's hard for us to relate to in some respects. But he's saying, be faithful whatever it costs. Because the way to conquer this way of evil, he's saying, is this way of Jesus. The only way to conquer is this way. There is no escaping earthly consequences. By the way, there's no rapture here, right? There are in some readings of Revelation this rapture where if you're super faithful, you get rescued before tribulation. Not so in John's Revelation. Everyone goes through these times of trial, and faithfulness is what saves us. But there's this promise of something greater still to come. Chapter 14 opens with another scene that John keeps kind of putting in as an interlude to all of this horrible stuff that's going on earth, this scene of heavenly worship. And it's in stark contrast to all of the violence and destruction on earth. We see there that unlike the monstrous beasts that destroy life in the previous chapter, what's being worshipped here is the Lamb, the slaughtered Lamb of God. And that worship is not offered to those by the beast, but by those who've been marked by the name of the Lamb and have the Father's name written on their foreheads. That likely doesn't refer to anything literal. People ask about this. What is that mark? How do I know if I have the mark? It's a mark of the heart more than anything. It also is probably an allusion to phylacteries. Do y'all know what phylacteries are? If Orthodox Judaism or in Judaism in general, you might sometimes see Jews with like leather strips bound around their arms and a little leather box on their wrists and a leather box bound around their foreheads. You see it in New York sometimes. And it goes back to a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 6. It's actually a passage that some of you would be familiar with, hopefully all of you familiar with, at least part of it, because it's where Jesus draws the first part of the Great Commandment. Deuteronomy 6 says this, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words I'm commanding you today in your heart. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead." This mark is this mark of faithfulness. The mark is a love of God and a love of neighbor. That's how you know if you're marked. That's the way out of the destruction. There's more in chapter 14. But I struggled a lot this week with how to wrap up this message. I've struggled throughout Revelation. Have any of you struggled with Revelation? The 5 or 6 of you that have actually read it as we've gone through this, have y'all struggled with this? Because it's hard, right? It's a hard book to read. It's hard to understand. It's easy if you read this to see how people can kind of make it out to be whatever they want it to be. There's so much symbolism, so much metaphor, that it's easy for this to get used and abused. It's easy to misinterpret it. I've struggled with it. I've struggled with it in part because as I read it again and again, and as I've been studying it again these last couple of months, though it's about first century Rome, there's a lot I recognize there. Are there things about what John says about first century Rome, things that John criticizes about first century Rome that sound familiar to you? Because I can't help but get away from the idea that if John was writing a revelation today, some of the images would be very much the same. If John was writing to the world's greatest power today, some of the criticisms would be very much the same. Not all of them, but enough that we should wrestle with it. We should wrestle with what it means to be in power. I wrestle with it myself because I feel like America is actually in a time of wilderness right now. Or at least I hope so. I hope that it's a wilderness time that we're in, that it's a time of preparing us for something better, to become who we're called to become, who we have thought we were before. Time to wrestle with God and country. I had one of those patches when I was in Scouts, by the way, that God and country patch. I didn't question America as much then as I do now. I question a lot of things about who we are, how we operate in the world, if at times we've deceived ourselves. And I hope and pray that we wrestle with that. Because with great power comes great responsibility. We have a responsibility as individuals and as a community and as a nation to make sure that we're marked with the right mark. That we're led by love of God and love of neighbor above all else. No matter what it costs. The question that we started this whole conversation with a few weeks ago is the question that I think is at the heart of Revelation. It's really, who and what do we worship? And what we're called to do is to worship this one, and not just this one, but this one way. This way of love and sacrifice. This way of love and sacrifice that can cost everything and yield even more. On the same night that Jesus was betrayed, he gathered his disciples in an upper room, took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body, and it's broken for you." After supper, he took the cup, and after giving thanks for it, he passed it to them as well, and said, "Take this and drink of it, all of you. It's my blood of a new covenant, a new, different way. It's poured out for you for forgiveness. As often as we eat of this bread and drink of this cup, we do so remembering him. We do so remembering the way of love he showed to us, and we do so grateful that all are welcome at the Lord's table."